right. We are recording the webinar today. Today is May 16th, 2014. This webinar is sponsored by the Taos Institute. Welcome to The Conversation, a webinar series on relational leading. And at this time, I would like to invite Saliha Bava, our host for today, to take the microphone. Saliha?
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you all for joining the conversation. I'm Saliha Bava, and I'm a faculty at Mercy College and faculty in the MS Relational Leading program. The conversation is an online space to explore social and relational practices that promote creative, collaborative, and appreciative processes in families, communities, and organizations around the world. The conversation is sponsored by the Taos Institute's Master's Program in Relational Leading. Our topic today is Igniting Collective Change, and our guests are Mary Gergen and Celiane Camargo. I'm so sorry, Celiane. Borges. Celiane is a core faculty in the MS Relational Leading program, and she's also faculty in the Imagineering Academy in Netherlands. She's also the advisory board member of Taos Institute Europe. And Mary Gergen is the co-founder and board member of the Taos Institute. Jeannie Belden-Charles, our program director, will be facilitating the conversation on the question window. So feel free to post your questions. And she'll also join me at the end when we open up for questions. So keep your questions coming, and we look forward to listening from you after we have had our conversation with Celiane and Mary. So I hand it over to Celiane and Mary. Thank you.
So hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I want to start by thanking Saliha, Jeannie, and Dawn for being the front end of organizing all these webinars, and also thanking Mary for being here with me today talking about this topic. Me and Mary, we have been very busy envisioning and structuring a course that I will be teaching at this Masters in Relational Leading. And this webinar was a great excuse for us to sit together more often and talk about what we would like to share with you today. And as you can see in the agenda, in the slides, this course will be an introductory course in social constructionism. So we're going to be offering core concepts of constructionism, giving base to this idea of relational leading. So we thought of bringing you today two core concepts that we find very important to discuss. One is focused on language as creating the world. The second one is a focus on the shift from the private individual into relational being. After that, we want to talk about some implications that embracing this, what might bring when you embrace those concepts, and some resources for action. So let's start. So Mary, would you like to add something else?
I think you've done a great job there about the agenda, and I invite you to begin with the idea of language as creating the world, the most important thing we have to say all day, probably.
Yeah, great. So the language in this approach is not conceived of a device to describe and represent the world, but as a way of constructing it. The constructionist approach emphasizes the ability to create realities through language, and therefore is a very fundamental aspect in the process of producing new action. So if you are describing something in a certain way and not other, you are creating some specific actions and not others. So in language, you are producing new actions and therefore new realities. A great example, I would say, it's right here at how we name these masters, relational leading. And this is already playing with the word of leadership and leading. And there is an invitation here to invest in a different reality for the program and for the education of the students, which leadership would focus more on skills and individuals, while leading is taken as a process, as something that's created collaboratively and in a context. So to me, it's a great example. And also, in talking to Mary this week, she was sharing with me a very interesting example of how language is also creating the world of organizations. And Mary, I think this is a good moment to share that. Shall I show this slide?
Yeah, that would be great. That would be wonderful. I wanted to give an example of what it means if you construct the world one way or another. I do want to emphasize, too, that one doesn't do it all by oneself, because that could be nonsense. That in order to use language to create the world, you do it out of some kind of a group that is already established that this language creates this kind of world. The example I wanted to give is from Gareth Morgan, who has written a book many times over, actually. He's written something called Metaphors of the Organization, and many of you probably read this book at some time in your undergraduate or perhaps MBA program. It's a very famous book in the organizational literature. But I noticed as I was reading his most recent edition that he has become more and more a social constructionist in his outlook. And he clearly is an ally. And in fact, I think he's an honorary associate of the Taos Institute. Let me just as an aside say, the Taos Institute is a nonprofit American organization dedicated to education, dedicated to creating social constructionist perspectives, especially in professional activities. So just so you know what the Taos Institute is, it's not just a touristic New Mexican organization advancing the goals of business in Taos. At any rate, what Gareth Morgan did was he suggested that ways that organizations are conceived of affects the way that it is developed, how the leadership roles are taken, what expectations people have for working in a place of this sort. And I think each of you might think about your own experiences as being a worker in an organization, whether it was McDonald's or the Girl Scouts or being in an academic environment as a student. I have listed here on the slide some of the key metaphors that have been used to explain what an organization is and how it operates. The machine metaphor has been very powerful in the United States in terms of organizations, that the organization is a machine, and therefore the workers, for example, are the parts of the machine. And so when a worker is a part of a machine, you can concentrate on the fact that it is not a human being with needs and wants and desires and goals. It is like a gear in a complicated machine. I think Henry Ford had that notion when he developed the idea of the line where workers did one little part and workers were replaceable and they were organized to do one job. And whether they liked it or not was not really a consideration. They got paid. The organism model suggests that an organization is more like a plant or an animal and has the capacity to grow and change and develop. And the language there is more a humanistic language of an organization. the brain metaphor suggests that an organization is an information processing group. Psychic prison was Morgan's taking on a Freudian theory to describe an organization, and that it was full of unconscious processes and repressions and defense mechanisms and power politics and so forth. And then a culture, that is, that it's like a tribe in a way. It has its rituals, its activities, its ways of doing things that are special to it. So every one of those metaphors produces different ways of talking about the organization, expectations for the organization, ways of leading. And I think in the United States after World War II especially, the idea was that the leadership was organized as though it were the army. So there would be the general, and then there would be the next level down, colonels, and then majors, and I don't know exactly how it goes, but down to the sort of infantry foot soldier who had no say at all in how things went. You obeyed. That was the crucial thing. I don't know, Sally Howard,
Yeah.
if I could a little example from Penn State. That there were two different things that made a difference, and I was at a regional campus of Penn State most of my career, and we trained and educated people mostly in their first 2 years, and then they went to University Park for their last 2 years of college. And one of the metaphors I had was that it was like the Soviet Union and we were Hungary, or we were Czechoslovakia. We produced the resources that were then taken into Russia to use. So we were second-class citizens. We did all the work, and they took all the profit. So I had a kind of a negative attitude sometimes toward University Park because their lack of respect for us, and they're using us to create their own ends.
And I was thinking, Mary, how those metaphors really create the reality and the way you relate and work with people. And this also, I was going back to the second concept. What is the reality that we create when we move from this individual rationality into this concept of relational being? Because for the constructionist perspective, the individual rationality is also a construction in language, meaning that's not conceived of an attribute of the individual thinking, but it's a consequence of our cultural conventions. So embracing the idea, the concept of the metaphor of relational being, it's also bring us a completely different way of relating in organizations in the academic context, right?
Oh yes. Oh, it's interesting that we are emphasizing the social nature of knowledge and the social creation of reality, and so also the social creation of individuals. And sometimes we talk about it as the notion of the multi-being, that is, the person who is co-created through their relational activities. And so there's a sort of an emptying out of the internal language of individualism and becoming more of the individual in the flow of activity. And it really flies in the face of a lot of humanistic psychology and also organizational literature. Almost all the organizational literature is very big on talking about individuality and the creation of individual skills. And so the idea of accepting the sort of malleability of a human in context is very interesting as a way of thinking about leading.
Yeah, with great consequences, because when you are not searching anymore for what's happening within heads of people, but relationships, then it really moves you into what I think was Sheila McNamee. She was writing last month at the TAL's website about relational sensibility, and which is about appreciating and being truly curious about differences and how that can build relations and can generate new understanding. So it's about creating spaces where different voices can have are welcome and can raise different opinions. So
you're talking about when you say differences, you mean people who you find very different from who you are in a particular context? Is that what you mean by differences?
Yeah, yeah. And those differences can be welcomed and embraced.
Right, right. I was just thinking about, I lived in Kyoto, Japan once, and my friend and I were going to take a flower arranging class, and I ended up taking this class, but she didn't, and I just thinking about who I was and entering into this context, which was extremely different from anything I knew, and there was no verbal language to be shared because everyone spoke Japanese in this class except for me, and no one spoke English. And so I had to enter into a relational process where I had to acquire the abilities to arrange flowers in a very different way from the Western way, and that I had to learn to kneel. I couldn't do it at first, but I acquired the capacity to be relationally correct in this setting, and through the course of the year I acquired a whole new way of being. My relational self was enhanced so much through nonverbal kinds of activities that shaped my body. It was an embodied activity that went beyond the verbal. I think you mentioned that once. Why are you laughing? Oh,
because that's a very beautiful story. I liked it. I like it because it's not. It makes me think that it's not just about welcoming new voices, but and creating this collaborative environment, but yourself gets shaped by this environment in which you are welcoming different ways of understanding and doing things. So it's about transforming the space while transforming yourself.
And I think also what we're implicitly saying here in this example is that when we say language creates the world, we mean more than words. We mean bodily posture. We mean something about smells and touches and movements and sounds that are not words, and that all of this together is part of the way of creating the world in a new way through linguistic and symbolic means.
Mm-hmm.
I see you have a new slide here.
Yeah, because I think we are getting into the implications of embracing these ideas. And we are already talking about many of them, but when we were discussing this week, we had wonderful stories, and we end up choosing these 3 implications, but I see we are already going beyond that.
Yeah.
I think
go ahead.
No, just one implication that is very much into the context of relational leading is moving from leadership as a combination of skills that you will acquire that usually focus on competence models, pretty much on steady way of behaving. And we are talking about leadership as an ongoing creative process. So in this context, it's not just acquiring a set of skills that will upgrade you to the status of being a leader, but it's a continuous process, that's an oriented activity that we do. We build it together.
I also think that this flows into the next implication, which is leading from everywhere, kind of, that leading is something that can happen no matter where you are in an organization if you are involved and facilitating and engaging across whatever kinds of gaps or continua there are. And so it isn't just a label for certain roles in an organization, but it also is kind of an activity that's ongoing, and it can involve you wherever and whenever. And that also leads to this third idea about the planned strategy versus the emerging strategy, that somehow it's too late to have 5-year plans. We have 5-minute plans. We have 5-hour plans. We have the belief, I think, that we must keep flexible and moving and aware of what's going on in our context.
And that doesn't mean we won't have a strategy, right, Mary? But like, we're going to hold those plans very lightly and being flexible and attentive to the moves on the go. I was thinking about how we need to recreate the expert position. That position that you always know what you should be doing.
I think we need to look at our resources in our few minutes that we have left, the kinds of things that we think are gains that you could acquire by being a part of the relational leading curriculum, so to speak. And I think you were just talking about the last resource that we had named. Where is it? Where is it?
Are you talking about the emerging strategy, or?
No, I'm talking about moving to the resources.
I have one example here from the masters, but also we have here the resources, and for time constraints, I would think that maybe you should move to the resources, and
yes, we can talk about
you can share one of.
So,
I know we talk about so many stories that would be illustrations of those resources. Why don't you just share one with us, Mary?
First, I want everyone to know letting go of the Lone Ranger means that it's not just the single individual that counts anymore. It's about joining in dialogical practices with an emphasis on listening, especially to what are called marginal members. I don't even know that there's time for a story, but I think that it's important to recognize that often marginal members are young people and people who hold secrets within them. This is what I've always thought, that because the way they're brought up, they have the possibilities of acting in ways that are unfamiliar. I did want to tell one story briefly, that a large chemical company wanted the American branch to downsize, and the idea was to cut 10% of the budget. And instead of downsizing, what the person in charge did was to set up 12 committees that went from janitors to vice presidents, all together in these 12 different groups, where they found cost-cutting ideas that were so effective that when they were all put together, it was possible to have a 10% cut in the budget due to the fact that all of these people from all levels of the company were able to join together and talk together openly, and everyone was listening to everyone else, such that knowledge that was shared in one part could be generalized to the other, so that people were able to somehow save money and no downsizing occurred. There's the generativity, if you will, of these conversations when people come together. Magic, almost.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to talk about another one of these resources?
I would love to, but I want to check with our timekeeper, because I know we have just
3 minutes. 3 minutes.
I think you guys are doing great, Celiane. So yeah, let's take one more example. That would be great.
Okay. So maybe in the same example, without starting a new story, what calls my attention is how it's very important to help the professionals to develop the sense of vulnerability, which is being willing to expose to this unknown space and trust that if you have some resources, some forms of work, you can trust that this new situation will emerge in more positive ways.
It sounds like horses galloping outside.
I thought of drums.
Drums from Brazil, right?
Yeah. So to me, again, going back to those three implications we were talking before, it's about having this emerging strategy. You have to know about your project. You have to have strategy, but you have to be willing to be vulnerable. And I guess constructionism can offer you some resources that gives you, I don't know if we can say a comfort, but it gives you something to work with that you can trust the process. And then you can create something that emerges when you put people together to work.
I love that. I love that expression, trust the process. And I think that's what we've come to realize, is that when you trust the process and you have sort of an openness to others, that there's a kind of a catalyst in all of this, that the leader becomes a catalyst for some kind of generative activity that goes beyond anyone's imagination up to that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that we're in a moment here, an emerging moment of transition to Ginny and to...
I think, Mary, I think you are in the perfect timing here of transitioning. Is there anything before we open it up for questions? There are lots of questions coming in.
Thanks.
No, I think we can let the questions come. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that rich conversation. Rather than give my own comments, I'll pose one of the questions we have. One question is, then why call it language? Why not refer to it as connecting or communication or interaction?
Good question.
Good question. I think that language itself is a word that can have an expansive meaning. And I think interaction emphasizes the action potential. Sometimes I think symbolic resources, but then does that include gestures? I guess so. Spatial relations, I don't know. It is an interesting question.
And yeah. I think it's also a comment about language. Language is a play of language too. What words mean in different contexts and how do they come alive in the context in which we are creating whatever the process may be. Celiane, what would you add?
I was thinking that it's very important to, when speaking the word language, in which context we're talking about. And when you're talking in the context of the ideas of constructionism, it's important to say that this is an embodied activity. We're not talking about words. Of course, language involves talking and stories, but it's also an embodied activity. There are forms of art in which you communicate, and this is language. But it's a tricky question because language is a differentiating device, so you cannot escape from giving this shape that excludes something. So it's, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Ginny.
I was going to say, this is Ginny, and I want to throw in a question that that I think relates to how do you take this to a practical level. So what if you're in a really target-driven kind of environment with really traditional leadership? How do you live this out? What can you do? How can you hold on to this way of thinking about it when you're in maybe a metaphor of the organization that's very machine-like?
I'm thinking about once I was in this organization and working with the vice president of a large communication company, and I always felt free to give my point of view. And one day he said to me, you know what's the matter with you? You don't have any deference. And then we had a discussion about the word deference, and I said that I really didn't like that word, and he said it was a very good word. I think I felt free. That was that because I was a consultant. I didn't have to obey. I think in the situation you're setting up, you have to be a lot more subtle about the way you resist.
Mm-hmm.
But if you resist in a subtle way, you may be able to create change that's to the benefit of everyone. I think it doesn't ever have to be a win-lose situation. But then you have a lot more experience as a consultant knowing what you do. What do you do?
Jeannie?
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that? I don't want to horn in on the dialogue that you two are doing, so.
You are more than invited, Jeannie.
Yes, so go for it, Jeannie.
Well, you know, when we talk about languages, I think part of what we're doing is we have to have facility in working in a lot of different languages, and in one sense, hierarchical organization has its own language. It has its own acceptable, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and so how do we learn to be good translators of what we see as important in every context? And I think that's, when we're talking about relational leading, we're really talking about how do we become skilled and have facility to move in different contexts and still be able to engage people and create going forward like the things that we're all trying to do.
So I guess a question that comes up that is from Daniel that's related to this is, by using relational leading, how does it affect the outcome of leadership or at the efforts of a leader?
Well, I think that if I understand this question, I'm not sure I do, I think it reduces the prestige and status of the traditional leader idea. I think it gets debunked a bit by this approach.
So then, which raises another question, one of our listeners has said about Giovanna has asked is, so how does that affect the power? And what
affect
the power that the person, the leader seeks?
Power, right?
Yes, thank you. Pronunciations. It's not my day today.
Yeah.
And that relates.
It's very challenging to the notion that power and knowledge resides at the top. It's got to have that implication.
And how will you move from experts into expertise? So that doesn't mean you don't have your knowledge and your power, but this is shared with other expertise, that they have their own knowledge and power, and then you can combine it and have what we used to say power with, not power over. And so it deconstructs the idea of experts and power in a traditional way, but it doesn't really abandon the idea that you study and you get prepared to work on different topics. So you are prepared, but in different ways.
And I don't want to hog all the questions that are coming in, Jeannie, but the conversation is so interesting because that's something else that somebody has raised in terms of shared expertise, and seeing everybody as a leader in that context is what they're saying. So that means everyone is a leader, I think it's so I'm not going to try pronouncing another name since I made a hash of your name, Celiane. I'm not going to say any more names today. I'm joking, but Joanna said something along those lines. I'm trying to find her question here, where she says, if you believe in everyone's expertise, I'm paraphrasing this, Joanna, then how do you deal with the team that expects you to know it all and to have all the answers? So how do you work with such a team?
You have to teach them that nobody knows it all and that it's okay. And I think if a leader allows that he doesn't or she doesn't know it all, it empowers the others to contribute more. And also there's less of a resentment. I mean, some people know a lot technically, and it's clear now that CEOs are not the leaders usually in technical knowledge, and to pretend you know things that people 3 levels below you know better is a fool's notion of knowledge. You've got to give up the notion that one person knows it all. I think Francis Bacon was the last one who knew it all, right? And that was 400 years ago. So it's just a ridiculous idea.
I think that, you know, we have a number of comments that go with that say I think it's like we're all in maybe violent agreement about that. And yet at the same time, the question is, how do we actually do that when people have to let go of power, in a sense, at the top in order to make that happen? How do you challenge? You know, how do people give up their power? And there's several questions in the stream about that. What does it take?
Yeah. Something that it's very important, well, at least to me, when I'm teaching my students at the masters here, when you give the constructionist ideas, it doesn't, I mean, you are talking a different paradigm. So it doesn't mean this top-down approach, that from now on we don't have experts, and then you bring that from top down into the organization. It won't work. So this kind of approach, you really need to prepare for those conversations. You really need to prepare for intervention. It's not a set of methods or techniques, but you have some resources for action. And since you are creating or co-creating realities and actions, you need to prepare people to talk differently. It's not just inserting the idea, but there's a whole phase of preparation before you enter into the here and now and action in your organization.
That's very, very interesting. And I think about how the Public Conversation Project in Boston prepares people to have a conversation. They set up certain kinds of conditions that make it possible. To go back to the question of being like the CEO and giving up power, the bottom line, I think, for a CEO is to achieve results. And if you seriously accept that the results will be improved, if you enter into a more democratic kind of relationship with those you work with, that there will be more power in the group, that the group will do more transformative things, generative things, then it's a win-win for you too, because there will be great outcomes from facilitating all the others in doing activities that are of profitability or productivity for the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Other comments? Oh,
yes, actually, when you were hearing the horses galloping, Mary, I was the one who was typing. Sorry, I didn't mute myself. So I apologize for that. Jeannie, do you see, I see a couple of questions on language. I'm wondering where would you like to go next?
Yes, I'm looking at that. But let me see. Have you got, why don't you go ahead, Sally?
I have one on, this is not on language. This is Celia. She's asking the question, what collective changes would you list as the most needed nowadays? That is a very interesting question.
Collective changes in what? In
anywhere? In organizations?
She hasn't specified, and that's why I thought it was interesting, because I think it depends on where you're working and what's your context.
Yeah. So, for example, one we've been talking about is this idea of shifting power as a change that's needed. And so, what else?
Well, that reminds me of a question that I wondered if it would come in, which is, what about this great discrepancy in pay between the people at the bottom and the people at the top? It's so much enlarged beyond what it was 50 years ago. If everybody's contributing and the generativity comes from leading, and anyone can lead and facilitate productivity, then shouldn't the profit be shared more generally? I think that's the change that's needed, but that's something that's maybe highly resisted in the corporate world.
Okay, this is Dawn. I'm gonna.
It's an interesting. Sorry.
I was just gonna say I'm gonna jump in here because we're just about out of time for questions. And is that okay if I kind of wrap this portion up? What I was going to say is all the questions that are coming in are fantastic, and we will try to look at these questions and address them in future webinars. We have several additional webinars coming up, and we will share your questions with the presenters of the webinars and try to address more fully some of these questions coming in. And we will have this recording available on our website after the call today. But Ginny and Saliha, did you want to kind of wrap up then?
Ginny, go ahead.
All right.
Thank you,
I
Dawn.
can't stop myself from responding to all the questions, so I keep going back to my typewriter and wanting to engage in conversations with all of you who are writing in great questions. And several people who've even suggested places like Zappos, which is a company that is applying these kinds of principles. So love the questions. We'll keep moving these forward as we continue our conversation. We wanted to just give you a little bit more information of another place where you can keep exploring these questions, and that is through our Master of Science in Relational Leading that is sponsored by the Taos Institute, and it's a 2-year program. It's in partnership with the Professional Development Foundation in London, who works closely with Middlesex University, who is the degree granting institution. And I would say one word about this: it's a practitioner-focused program. Middlesex is known and PDF for their work with practitioners, with credit for work experience, and we're engaging in small international and online learning cohorts to continue this kind of learning, to explore what it means to lead in complex conditions, in the global conditions of the 21st century. And so we'd really like to invite you to check us out. Our website, let's see, can I move those slides forward? There we go. Program information can be found at relational-leading.net, and you can go, if you go there, you'll get to our website. You can find more information about the program and how to send us an inquiry form if you're interested. You'll get on our mailing list, and we'll continue to be in conversation with you, and you can certainly contact me directly at my email address if you'd like more information as well.
Thank you, Jeannie.
Right. You're welcome.
And I wanted to thank Mary and Celiane. It was a very rich conversation, and thanks, Jeannie, for joining in, and thanks, Mary, for inviting her. Any last words from either of you or both of you before I wrap up? Great.
No, it was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. We have more webinars coming up. As you can see, we have 3 more in June. The next one is on June 3rd, and we'll be looking at the practices associated with relational leading. So keep posting your questions on our Facebook, or you can Twitter them out. You can follow us on our Taos Institute Twitter account if you are not already. And also you can direct some of these questions at any of our speakers here, Mary Gergen, Jeannie, or myself. And please visit Celiane's website, and we welcome comments on how we can make these webinars more rich for you, as well as questions about the topic itself. We look forward to meeting you on June 3rd, and I think with that, I wish you all a happy day and a happy night wherever you are. Thank you all, and thanks to our presenters again.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you all.
Hi, thank you.